So I'm really happy to have again Musa Mahmodi here. Musa is the Executive Director of the Independent Afghan Commission for Human Rights. Always mix up, sorry, the acronym. And so he just arrived from Kabul on Sunday, and he will be with us for three days. He has a very experienced career as a lawyer, as a human rights activist, and for the past couple of days we've been talking about his experience with the students as well, and we've been learning amazing things about Afghanistan and about your everyday fight, and even more theoretical as well, a question about the implementation of human rights, how to conceptualize human rights, and how human rights concept translate into the local reality in Afghanistan. So tonight we're going to raise of course, again, the issue of human rights challenges in Afghanistan, but maybe we're going to talk about on a more practical, pragmatic perspective, and what's your daily job, basically, and how you can really try to make this, human rights idea and concept a reality in Afghanistan. So please welcome our guest.
Thank you very much, Sufi, and it's such an honor, such a pleasure to be here and speaking to you. I'm talking on a very important subject, which is human rights, and I think human rights is a value that makes distinction between who we are and what we can achieve, and it is because we are human. We have human rights and freedom. So that's very important to underline that issues. I would talk about three issues tonight, and one thing is that I would go to who we are, what we are doing in Afghanistan, because that is very important to the issues that I would open up. The second, the context and the situation in Afghanistan, and the third, the actual human rights promotion and protection in a country that was post-conflict country and now back to the conflict-affected country. Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission is a national institution with constitutional and legislative mandate to monitor human rights situation and work for promotion and protection of human rights across the country. It is very much based on Paris Principle, and Paris Principle set very much the standards for national human rights institutions to do a job as a national human rights protection mechanism, a national mechanism for protection of human rights in countries, and we are very happy that there are more and more human rights commissions are established around the globe to monitor human rights at the national level. So the Commission of Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission is one of that, with a governing body of 9 commissioners and 6 program areas that includes women's rights program, child rights program, monitoring and investigation program, people with disability program, transitional justice program, human rights education program, and of course there are programs like a special investigation unit that only investigate and monitor conflict-related incidents in the country, and police ombudsman office that monitor police behavior and treatments of individuals in the country. We have a broad mandate. We monitor detention centers, we monitor prisons, we monitor shelters for women and children, we monitor correction centers. We also go to provinces and districts and collect data and information relevant to socio-economic rights of Afghan people and how they would enjoy their rights and freedom every day. We have around 600 staff that is in 14 provinces. We were established very much after the collapse of Taliban, because you know that the 3 decades of war in Afghanistan ruined the infrastructures of a state, the justice, and everything that were there. And that started in 1978 by invasion of the Soviet Union, when they invaded Afghanistan, and then a war started, by resisting against occupation of Soviet Union, and led by Mujahideen and supported by international community. Then the Soviet Union era ended by withdrawal of Soviet Union troops and defeat of Soviet Union. But there was a gap that the communist regime that remained could not resist Mujahideen power, and then Mujahideen came into power. Then, unfortunately, we went to another era of civil war that different factions in Afghanistan started fighting against each other. So there was no structure as a state. And then Taliban suddenly emerged from somewhere, and they took over power, and then they started fighting against Mujahideen groups and took over 95% of Afghanistan. In all these three periods of war, different factions and different government in power and individuals committed a lot of atrocities, war crimes, and human rights, gross human rights violations. So immediately after the collapse of Taliban, with the international community's assistance, one of the area that were identified that should be focused on was the promotion and protection of human rights. And for that purpose, national human rights institutions, that is our commission, was established with clear mandate. But human rights challenges and human rights issue remained a big problem for Afghanistan, even in the post-Taliban era. Not only because we inherited a lot of a big legacy of violations of human rights, a big legacy of atrocities, a big legacy of crimes that committed during the 3 periods of war, but because there were no infrastructure as such that to start protection of human rights. When it is a human rights issue, and if you look at the literature and and scholars, they would cite us. This is the rights of the human rights is a projection or manifestation against the organized power of a state. So this is the state that protect and fulfill and respects human rights. It is meaningful again rights and freedoms of individuals against the states in most of the time. But then you are about horizontal and vertical way of human rights, that the state is not only have to actively protect human rights of you, but it also should not omit that human rights violation happens because of omission of the government or states, that other individuals or groups and entities start harming people and denying human rights or freedom of that. That's exactly the situation that when the state is not strong happens. Then your human rights is violated every day, but by different entity of not necessarily with government, but entities that are your human rights are not necessarily violated by the government, by state, but by entities who are affiliated with the state or under the operating in the territory of a state. So that challenge remained at the very beginning by a lot of militia groups, a lot of people who inherited and kept their weapons from the fighting era. And then after the resurrections of Taliban in 2004, the human rights violation continued. When we talk about human rights violations, it is at all level, and it's violations of all sorts of human rights. from torture at the beginning. For example, if we were going to monitor detention centers and prisons, torture was a norm to get confession. And when we were asking that it is illegal and it is crime and it is a violation of human rights and it's forbidden at all time that you cannot practice torture, they said, oh, how can we, get this person confession, and then our case would be rejected by court because we don't have a confession, we don't have anything. Then, it took so much of energy and time of us that, train new police and prosecutors that not only go to confession, but, make investigation on evidence-based, on other materials that are available, and bring those people who are suspected of committing crimes to justice. Issue of discrimination has been a very, very big issue in Afghanistan. There were discrimination spread and very, very much against women in Afghanistan, against ethnic minorities in Afghanistan. And that women were deprived of going to school, going to work during the Taliban, and that very much remained in place even after collapse of Taliban, because the infrastructure was not as such to encourage women, or because women were deprived of their rights and freedoms, including rights to education, to be prepared for taking a role in public affairs. So unfortunately, that same thing is happening still. We have a high rate of illiteracy among women, and that's 86% of women are illiterate in Afghanistan, and that's an obstacle on the way of complete participation of women on public affairs, and it exacerbates situation like violence against women in Afghanistan, as such that the baseline for violence against women remained pretty much the same over the 5-6 years. We, as a Human Rights Commission, we register around 5,000 to 6,000 cases of violence against women every year. However, women made some progress, like the new constitution that for the first time guaranteed the equality between men and women in Afghanistan, and allowed men and women to participate in political activity, like in all 3 rounds of presidential elections and 2 rounds of parliamentary elections. Women not only participated as voter, but they also ran as a candidate. And there is actually a quota system in Afghanistan that allows for women to get seats guaranteed for them to go to parliament. And that's a great leap from a situation that women could not go out of houses to a situation that we're sitting as a policy makers in parliament, as lawmakers in parliament, and making their presence known to the public and the society. The other area of the human rights violations that remained in place, and that's a challenge even today, was that how you can protect people who are living in conflict. So in that regard, you have a huge number of population who are every day affected by war and conflict. People, women were vulnerable, children were vulnerable, and they were bearing the brunt of miseries of war every day, even if it's hunger or civilian casualties, directly or indirectly. A number of women and children that killed, maybe not higher than that. Many men were killed during the period of time of war, but they are still, losing a person, a member of family that are breadwinners, or they're providing support to them, and they are very much affected by the loss of beloved one there. And when they are displaced, that's the same things. The number of displaced people, IDPs, are so high that we have now around 1,200,000 people displaced internally in Afghanistan, and 160,000 of them were very freshly displaced by effect of war. Civilian casualty went also very high, and every year, unfortunately, there is an increase on the number of people who are killed because of oppression and of Taliban and anti-government forces in general. That includes Haqqani and Hizb Islami, and also pro-government forces, militias and government forces, and the international coalitions. And from 2008 to up to 2015, over 39,000 people were either killed or injured. So that's a huge number of people that we lose in the battle, and that's, if your life is in danger, then the rest of the freedoms and rights would not be meaningful to you if you don't have that safety and that security. Other issues that are very much important in the context of Afghanistan, that many people are vulnerable to war, but they need to be supported by NGOs and aid workers and the human rights defenders and civil society and activists and others. Unfortunately, the situation is as such that they are attacked every day, and they are killed because of the work that they are doing. We have issues of human rights defenders being threatened or killed, individuals who are working for NGOs and civil society, they are threatened or killed. Even vaccinators, those who are providing vaccination for small children, they are killed, or aid workers, that they are killed. So that is the challenges of the human rights situation in Afghanistan. And then it would the socio-economic rights is also very important in the context of Afghanistan, because people are poor, the GDP is very low, and the state could not provide the kind of rights that people are entitled, like access to food, access to shelter, access to standard the living standard of living, and the sanitation, the water, access to healthcare, access to education. We are very proud to say that we have achieved to send 9 million children to school, and that's because of the international community's support. But you know that 3 million children are out of school, and that's almost a big portion, 30 to 35% of children who could go to school is still deprived to go to school. We are very proud that to say that 60% of Afghans are covered by healthcare provisions that are provided to them. But what about the rest, the 40% that they don't have access to any kind of healthcare in Afghanistan, and they could easily lose life or from a very, very a basic disease in a country, and that affects a lot of children and women. We also both have progress in the area of children rights, and also a lot of challenges there. Children are exploited for the purpose of war. They are exploited for sexual exploitation. They are lured to by human traffickers to go to countries as in the region, to Saudi Arabia, to Iran, to Pakistan, and to Central Asia, and as far as to Europe, brought here. And their human rights and their safety and dignities are every day in danger. So that's a huge issue. We conducted an inquiry a year ago on bachabazi that was a practice widespread in Afghanistan with no legal provision to prevent that. but did not approved by the society, but it was left alone as a taboo. No one was talking about it, no one was speaking about it, and a lot of children, young boys, were exploited by organized crime groups or individuals, and they were actually kept in slavery kind of situation, that they were dancing for those individuals or a group of individuals, or exploited sexually, or trafficked from one province to other province for the purpose of children, that bachabozi, which is the boy dancing in English. So we conducted a national inquiry on that issues and found that it is spread across Afghanistan and everywhere, and that's not only practiced by individuals that were affiliated with the individual with power, but even police were using that, even military were conducting that kind of practices. And you might have heard and read articles on New York Times that even the international troops were aware of some of these practices, but they couldn't do anything, or they didn't do anything to prevent those kind of issues. So overall, that this kind of challenges are there, but what were the mechanisms to make sure that human rights are getting better in Afghanistan and protected better there? Let me talk a little bit about the Afghanistan is party to the 7 major international human rights instruments that includes civil and political rights, Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Covenant on Economic Social Rights, CRC, this Child Rights Convention, CEDA, the Convention on People with Disability, and all those laws are under Article 7 of a Constitution are applicable in Afghanistan. The state has to fulfill it and in the country. And then there is a chapter in our Constitution that completely talks and guarantees human rights and freedom of Afghans. Almost all provisions that are manifested in Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the said conventions. Then there are a lot of work being done that these conventions and then these instruments to be implemented in Afghanistan. Some of them are just approved by Parliament as a law. Some of them are incorporated provisions to domestic laws and legislations like penal codes, like EVA law, and juvenile law, and the laws that the other laws that we have. And we have a very strong, we set up and help the government of Afghanistan to set up a mechanism to report. Like we have reported 2 rounds of UPR, the Universal Periodic Review, to Human Rights Council. That's an instrument that could hold accountable a state. We also not only had that from the state, but shadow reports that provided by the Human Rights Commission, and also reports to the Committee on Economic Social Rights by the states, and shadow reports by the Commission and the NGOs, reports to the Committee on Child Rights, and again the shadow reports or alternative reports, and reports on the Committee on CEDA. The only issues that we are waiting for is that a report that is now prepared to be submitted to the Committee on torture, prevention of torture, and we hope that that's also reviewed. But the outcome of that reporting is, what is the outcome? 424 recommendations altogether, coming back to Afghanistan and saying that you have to implement those recommendations. Most of them something that it is beyond the capacity of a country like Afghanistan to implement it. In addition to that, the 52 reports that the Commission has published on different thematic areas, because we reports on child rights, on human rights situation, on economic social rights, on political rights, on women rights, on violence against women rights. Hundreds of these recommendations are placed to the government to do the job. But then the government has been also, very, very good in some areas, like, we last year, the National Action Plan on peace, on women, peace, and security was signed by the president, and that's implementable, and that translate the resolution 1325 to something actionable, and that is a guarantee for women participation in peace process, in the worries that we are now facing in Afghanistan. That's what would happen, what would it mean for human rights and women rights if a peace process taking root with Taliban and effectively going to result some things. That is a guarantee that women have a role in negotiating peace, in being an election, on public affairs arena, and have more of a role there. However, that's not a complete guarantee, because those laws, including National Action Plan on Women in Afghanistan, and so many other laws that we have, those are as good as that are implemented in Afghanistan, as good as that are implemented by judiciary, by prosecutors, by police, and a greater understanding of society and citizens about their rights and freedom. So that's also challenging, that how you can spread the awareness among the public that you are entitled of rights and freedom, and you have to enjoy that, and you have to ask and demand for it from state, and also hold the state accountable when there is a breaches of your rights in different areas. So I will stop here. I think I spoke a lot, and would be happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I will just start by a couple of questions before opening the floor. There are a few things that we mentioned during lunch that I think would be very interesting to express here again for us to all really understand the issue here. So, from what we understand is that the legal frame necessary to implement human rights in Afghanistan exists. I mean, the country has signed most of the international agreements, convention, covenants, etc., etc. So, at the end of the day, what are the main factors that jeopardize the implementation of human rights? Is it a lack of political will, or is it a lack of state capacity? Is it a lack of fund? So I'd like you to elaborate a little bit on that. And you actually, on that note, you mentioned a bit earlier that a lot of the recommendation that the country received were beyond its capacity. So what is the actual capacity, or what are the actual capacities of Afghanistan in terms of rule of law?
So we are, in that regard, we are dealing with a state that is not strong enough to, discharge the responsibility that the state has. We are talking about a state that is weak in terms of infrastructure, in terms of capacity, in terms of leadership, because and in terms of challenging that it faces from an active war that is going on against the state, to a lack of stressing or manifesting power to the different corner of the country. So that's a state failure or a state weakness that we face in Afghanistan. The second issue is that, yes, the political will, because the structure of the power relationship and power sharing is as such that there are different entities there, from notorious warlords that are participating in the government to those who are, involved in atrocities and human rights violations, both during the Soviet Union, during the civil war, during the Taliban regime, and they are in power. So it is more of a kind of compromising policies that, okay, we should not touch these issues because if we touch, very much or press charges against some of the culprits and the human rights violators, then we would see more of a challenge in the country. So it's more of political observation about being strong enough for protection of human rights. And then the political will is also very much undermined because of the rivalries between different factors and entities there. Then it comes to the capacity of the state. Yes, the capacity is not there because a lot of law enforcement section of the government, they don't have training. They are, a fast track kind of people putting on job. They just, some of them are coming from a militia background, or some of them are coming from training that are poor and they're not at the level of understanding the concept of human rights and implementing, or they are ideologically biased against the human rights, and then they says, okay, why we should we still not very much into those issues, or we can in the best scenario they are not sensitive, in the worst scenario they are against provisions of human rights. And then the issue of resources. A lot of human rights, provision of human rights needs resources, and the prerequisite like security and safety and the presence of the states in different areas. We conducted a report 2 years ago in Afghanistan on access to justice, and we find out that out of 365 districts, in 92 districts, there were no court system, no prosecutors. So it is almost 1/3 of the country where they didn't have access to court, the actual infrastructure there. So that would make the situation worsen. Then what you have in place would be warlords, Taliban, and others who would do different kind of brutalities and cruel actions against citizens, and citizens would not benefit from the protection of the government. But these are not, a very, very dark situation that we see. There are also glimmers of hope here and there, like, for example, the activities that we do, the activities that other human rights organizations doing, it helped a lot of people to, enjoy human rights, like the number of people we release from custody of police or, prisons that are illegally, detained, or the number of private prisons that we closed across Afghanistan, and there is no private prisons anymore. We closed 50 private prisons in Afghanistan. Could you believe that? So now no more private prisons are operated in Afghanistan. So these are all the capacity or the awareness kind of issues that are enabling environment that we provide for human rights. And the number of people we engaged in awareness program, it was around 500,000 people directly benefited from our workshops and seminars. It's not a lot because we have 30 million of population, but it exemplify a trend that more people are getting into issue of human rights, and awareness about human rights is there. But unfortunately, the issue of capacity, lack of resources, lack of political will, and the different kind of rivalries between factions remain a challenge for implementation of international obligations of a state when it comes to human rights in Afghanistan.
Hi, so my question is, you mentioned pro-government forces that have killed or injured people. Does the government come out and disavow these forces, or what are they doing to combat people who say they're working with the government but are violating human rights?
The people, when we talk about the civilian casualties, as were discussed yesterday, it's more of an outcome of disproportionate use of force or excessive use of force, and it is in the matter of theater of war that people are killed by the pro-government forces. There are very little instances or examples that intentionally civilians are killed by pro-government forces, but of course there are, it's not that it's no instance, but very few instances if that were there. But when it comes to that, I think government did a very good job recently, assigning fact-finding missions and prosecuting those who were in charge of, commanding that battalions and what went wrong. Like the case of Saidabad, a district outside Kabul, there were a kind of rocket attack in a village, and then the rocket landed in a mosque and killed a number of children there. Immediately, all those command structures that were involved and the people who fired, they were detained by the government, and the investigation started, and they started what went on there. So that kind of action by government is there. But of course, there are, when there are crossfire in many instances, it is very difficult for, government of Afghanistan to go after, people who have omitted the responsibility that they have. What we did was that how we can engage, the military that are so important both for providing security to Afghanistan at the same time to, honor the obligation of Afghanistan under international humanitarian law. So we started training, and now we are in negotiation with the National Academy, Military Academy, that they train all officers and all cadets, that they understand the IHL and the obligation of the states and the role of engagement, and there are legal advisors at the level of corps and at the level of divisions and battalions, that they advise commanders that you observe international humanitarian law and not to engage in an operation that would be a fear of harming civilians or collateral damage and issues like that. But unfortunately, it's inevitable. When we first put our reports on the civilian casualties in 2008, the role of pro-government force in killing civilians were 40%, and anti-government forces were 60%. Now the role of the pro-government forces, lowered down to 8 to 9%, and the role of Taliban and anti-government forces went to 78%. So that means that government has been effective, and we had also a couple of trials of soldiers who committed, crimes against civilians, killing civilians or looting properties. So those kind of things are encouraging, but still, harming one civilian is too much and too many for us when we want for absolute accountability of government forces there. No, they don't, but there are, in instances like torture, like other issues, maybe there are powerful people that government cannot effectively go after them and, bring them to justice, but on killing and, and officers of army, they have done, in most instances, not on all instances, a very good job.
I heard that bribery was a very big problem in Afghanistan, and I was wondering if you thought that corruption or lack of transparency was a big obstacle to achieving human rights.
Absolutely, absolutely. We are seeing corruption as a weakness of the government and the state. and weakness of rule of law, and also causing weakness of rule of law and weakness of the government. So it's something that perpetuating, a situation that it continues and continues like that. Unfortunately, it has been widespread, and it's no secret or hidden fact in Afghanistan. And if you look at the recent Transparency International report and many other reports, you see Afghanistan down to the bottom in terms of transparency and in terms of fighting effectively against corruption. And that corruption is a direct threat to the enjoyments of human rights. Judges, prosecutors, police, officials who are providing public services to people, they're prone to corruption. And when there's corruptions, people could be deprived of education because a principal is corrupt and taking money all in his pocket and not providing textbooks and chairs to children, and children could stay away from education. Or a head of a hospital or clinics, selling all the medicines out to the open market, and then people have to suffer from that. Or a justice, because taking bribe would not attend to the petition of a woman or a vulnerable member of a society because the other party gave, a big bribe to a judge or a prosecutor. So that is unfortunately there. However, we should say that a lot of awareness, a lot of campaign are going against corruption in Afghanistan. Civil society is very much engaged on that. Now if you go to Kabul, many of the streets walls are painted with eyes, big eyes, and say this, we see you, and taking bribe and participation in embezzling and corruption is wrong. So a lot of creative ways of engaging people is there. So, but unfortunately, it's still not. In the absence of a strong judiciary, a strong rule of law system, it is very difficult to go after, after corruption. But awareness raising is there. Many people are sensitive to that. I think there are, a demand side for corruption and a supply side for the corruption. So the demand is from the public that they want to expedite the process of their work or their sometimes illegal demand, and they are willing to pay bribes to the officials, and then the officials would provide that and say that's okay, if you give us money we do that, otherwise we wouldn't do that. So that is there, but when there is awareness and consciousness about citizens that you should not participate into bribery, they have to, at some stages, bear the cost of that. I'm telling you a very small story. We had a problem with our very high bill for electricity. And then we said, let's look at this why we are getting this high electricity bill, and the neighbors are getting very lower electricity bill. And then we went to the charges, and he said, okay, it's easy. If you give us 10,000 Fs, we will lower your bill. And my brothers came home and said, okay, we solved that. We can lower our bill. I said, how? They asked for 10,000. He said, no, you cannot give the bribe to the person. Then believe me, for 3 weeks, every night at 6 o'clock in the evening in summertime, we didn't have electricity. It was cut off. Then we had to send, anyone was there, my brother or other persons, to bring this electricity, the mechanic guys, the person, to fix that issue. And then he said, no, I cannot come, and it's costly. I have to take a taxi and things. then they had to pay for the taxi fees or other issues to bring him, or other. So then if you are not participating, you are penalized because you are not participating on those issues. There are so many other examples of that. If you go to pay your taxes, if you don't pay bribes, then you would not be successful to pay your taxes because it would be so difficult for you. However, there are a lot of changing policies and a lot of practices are going on, but I believe it will take time because we have to put the infrastructure right there.
Hi, you mentioned that in the Constitution there are sections about human rights. I was wondering, what are human rights defined as in the Constitution?
The definition of human rights? Well, the Constitution actually repeated all the rights that are recognized by, and manifested by Universal Declaration, that everyone has rights to life, to dignity, no one should be tortured, everyone is equal before law, everyone is guaranteed to have fair trial, have access to lawyers, to remain silent, to access the rights to have
certain rights.
Yes,
that are defined.
Certain rights like rights to freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of. So this is very specific and detailed. Almost all of these rights from the Universal Declaration and the conventions that Afghanistan is party is that reflected in the Constitution and guaranteed there. And I think in this region, our Constitution is the most liberal one and broadly, I should say, broadly protect human rights. So in terms of constitutional rights, we are one of the countries in the region that, very much advanced in that regard. Even on the freedom of religion, Afghanistan is a very conservative society, but the freedom of religion is guaranteed in the constitutions of Afghanistan, and that is, all other religious groups could practice their rights. And also there is provisions that not only mosques, but all, religious places could get support from the government in that constitution. So that's a kind of advancement that we can see. The problem is that how we can get this provision into real implementation, how we can hold a state and the government accountable for what is guaranteed in the constitutions, the legal provision there. So that's very much broad in terms of interpretation and definition of human rights of Afghan citizens. And also there is a provision that foreigners who live in Afghanistan, they would also enjoy human rights in the country based on law. So that's pretty much for all individuals. It's not only Afghans, but anyone lives in Afghanistan would enjoy certain, their human rights there, their basic human rights there.
You mentioned that there were international organizations that are also involved, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on what a few organizations are that come in and help, and it may be examples of what they do. We
have the UN Assistance Mission in Afghanistan. That's have a strong mandate in terms of protection of human rights and promotion of human rights.
Can you repeat the name?
UNAMA, United Nations Assistance Mission to Afghanistan, UNAMA. So that's the mandate is assigned to them by Security Council, United Nations Security Councils, and that's almost every year renewed. We have a strong presence of Amnesty International in Afghanistan, and they are very active in providing a lot of statements and looking into these issues. And helping Afghans, especially they are very active on the area of conflict-related issues. We have Human Rights Watch. Human Rights Watch is also there. We also have many other European NGOs were specifically, or US-based NGOs were specifically who are, dedicated in one part or other part of the human rights promotion, like Save the Children from different chapters of different countries are there, and pretty much many countries are doing there, and the Italian NGO is COSPI. They also do some of their work on human rights defenders. So we could name, a lot of other organizations, and most of the UN Women, UNDP, UNICEF, UNFPA, they all have, mandate on, or they have projects on women issues. Even WHO, they come up with an amazing project, the gender, on the gender issue, health protocol that, monitor hospitals, injuries of women if it's from violence against women. So a lot of activities and support of international communities there. However, there is a caveat there, and that is that if the international community going to disengage from issue of human rights and promotion and protection of human rights, what would happen in Afghanistan? Can we maintain the pace of progress toward realization of human rights and institutionalization of human rights without the support and the engagements of the international community? That's a worry that many Afghans have, and that's a real concern, I think, there.
You mentioned the closure of private prisons due to human rights violations. How long did that process take, like building up your case against it? And since human rights aren't necessarily entirely recognized, how challenging was it to find forces or other groups to assist you in closing these private prisons?
The issue was that we were dealing with a transition that the post-Taliban era created a vacuum of power, and the government was very much involved in putting together processes toward the democratization of the country, like election, like new constitution, like the other process for state building and nation building that started in Afghanistan. And that was very much an opportunity for strong, powerful people who could run in one part or other part of the country, and they were doing almost as a government. So they were running private prisons, running private militias, police. If they would dislike people, they would put in prison. If they liked people, they even did not press charges on those issues. But it was pretty much very swift process. Once we started and verified that there were a private prison, then we could send it to the government and say that there is a prison, and that is a lot of violations of human rights would happen. And at that time, because of the strong role of the international community and forces there as well, when the government were interfering, so it was much easier. It was done because of the support of the government mostly, but also because of the kind of cooperation with the people and that they brought the reports to us, and then we were able to verify it, and going back to the government forces or the international forces that were there in the form of PRTs and other issues. But so we also a lot of support from civil society and others. So it was not a long process. It was within a year or two that took that all the prisons were verified. It was not that a prison was identified and then it remained there for a long period of time. No, it was that the process of identifying and verifying a private prison was, like that period of time, because we were aware that many people are trying to operate a private prisons in the country.
Good evening, and thank you very much for your talks, both today and yesterday. I was very impressed with your description of the internally displaced, of a very important, let's say, reality, situation in the country, which we in Europe obsess with our refugee issues. We don't look at much, or we are not aware. But and also, I was. However, my question is about the Taliban, because you describe how strongly they are rooted in the country. Somehow they come back. They are still there. They're extremely dangerous, extremely radical in their behavior. Some years ago, I read an analysis of the Taliban in terms of being connected with something very Western, the middle classes. That is, people with a certain education, or urban or urbanizing, people on the rise, or landowners, things like that. I would like to look, your opinion on this kind of sociological analysis that comes onto that. So, who are these people in social terms? I think that's a very important kind of a background that is very often not given.
Taliban is, mostly coming from madrasas that are, outside Afghanistan, mostly in Pakistan. And they, actually were organized from those madrasas at the first place.
Can you explain what a madrasa is?
Yeah, madrasas are religious run schools that teaching theologies and Islamic jurisprudence and this kind of issues to the students, and then they become clergies and mullahs and spiritual readers, in a sense, to lead, mosques and sermons and congregations of people for prayers and for other things. But Taliban, they become very politically active, and they become, a military force, using that organization with the support of the neighboring countries, and at the time Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and because they wanted to force in Afghanistan. And they remained in power for pretty much some time, and then 9/11 happened, and the international community came in, and they were defeated from Afghanistan and completely wiped out from the country. They went, to their safe havens in Pakistan and reorganized and regrouped and came back in 2005, 2006 pretty much, and then the situation intensified. They are mostly coming from the poor families, because those are the people who could not afford to raise their children or send them to schools. They send them to these madrasas to get free education, free food, and some, wages. And at the end of the day, it's also a job security that they can, get some jobs at the, for the services that they provide to the people and congregation. But then when they go to madrasas, there are all kinds of issues. They are trained in military, they are trained in so many other aspects like suicide bombing, political Islam, and aspiration for taking over the power. And when they come back, where they are most successful, in the areas that are not urban areas, it's very rural areas. It is disconnected from the government. There are less, public services provided to them. Government is very weak in terms of presence and in terms of protecting those people. And it is interconnected with so many other illegal activities like drug traffickings, like, protecting farmers for growing opiums there. And then they take their own taxes from opiums, and then it would be a good bargain between farmers and Taliban. because if they allow the government would not allow them to grow opium there. So it's all kind of interactions that taking root there. And then, of course, there are sympathizers among rural areas in some pockets of the country that they would see that, okay, this Taliban is either ethnically or others would think, but it is not in a sense that middle class or educated people would support or go to Taliban. Even farmers, even very, very poor people, if you have give them a choice between a government is that apparently incapable of doing a lot of things to the people, and Taliban, they would choose a government, and that was evident in the 3 rounds of elections in Afghanistan, that the people participated and came out and casted their vote to elections, and they did not stay in their houses. And the good thing and positive thing is that we had lower level of participation in the cities and higher participation at the rural areas during elections. So that shows that Taliban is there. They have their operations, and that's because of they have Kalashnikovs and they can intimidate people there sometimes. But of course, it is a reality that sometimes people sympathize with them because either they come from the same village or they are providing on protecting their interests. Either it's farming interest or some other issues that are there.
Hi. I have a follow-up question to your response. So there have been some instances that have been noted that educated people have been recruited into the Taliban, or they have decided to willingly join the Taliban. In your opinion, what do you think is like the psychological reasoning, or what would drive them to want to join, even if they're educated and come from a well-to-do family or a well-off family, in comparison to these poorer families who don't receive an education? I
don't come across a situation that middle class or wealthy family or with education, with good education, joined Taliban. There are instances that educated people joined ISIS, but not Taliban. As I hear say, reportedly, I heard that sometimes there are people, with some degree of education that go to Taliban. It is a result of different things. Either they are, kids and angry with their families and they join Taliban, or it is because the culture of violence, the culture of to do whatever you can do, when with your Taliban, you're not under any restrictions, could lure them to Taliban, or the kind of brainwashing strategy that Taliban are deploying to and employing to recruit from the educated or from mostly from rural families, but sometimes educated families as well. But there is a reality there as well that Taliban is coming or representing some part of Afghanistan, and then sometimes the ethnic clashes would also be a factor that if there are people with some level of education or sympathizers, they go join Taliban. However, at the center of Afghanistan, in Kabul, there is a big fight between people who have more tendency to make compromises and ceasefire and peace with Taliban because of many factors that I mentioned to you, and those who were absolutely against such compromises and peace process because of either ethnic backgrounds or ideologic background, or because of affiliation with this party or that party. So it is very complicated, but it is not at the level that would pose a threat or a big portion of the society. however, the ISIS issue has been completely different. We had reports, people joining ISIS, even going to Syria or to Iraq from a very middle class family, very educated, finishing high school, finishing university, and then they joining us. And that's because they don't learn a lot about, other values like, sometimes human rights and democracy and tolerance and things like that. And they are, unfortunately connected through Facebook and through other channels. They listen to that and they join. But number of Afghans were very few. And of course, there is other part of that as well. Refugees and Afghans who are, living in Iran, they are sent to, fight against ISIS and against other groups in Syria and Iraq and other parts. So it's really difficult to really judge on that issues. But Taliban is mostly relying on people who are living in the rural areas.
And for that to be quite clear for all of us, where do you draw the line and the differences, I really want them to understand, between the Taliban and ISIS?
Well, Taliban is very much, a group that are active in Afghanistan and in Pakistan. So there are Pakistani Taliban and there are Afghan Talibans. And they pledge their allegiance to Mullah Omar as Amir al-Mu'minin, or leader of the believers, they called it. It is. They also had the same aspirations to, establish a Khilafat, Islamic State, and rule over the world, and make sure that all the countries of Central Asia and Uyghurs from China and people living in Arabic countries and Palestine be liberated, and after they established this Khilafat. But now they have been very much contained in Afghanistan and Pakistan, but they inspired many other jihadi groups, like that now you have ISIS and others. Then ISIS is, the center is in Iraq and in Syria, and they are now more globally operational, and they are drawing a lot of recruits from Europe, from United States, from Central Asia, from Afghanistan, from Pakistan, and they have established chapters of their caliphate in many of these countries, including in Afghanistan. And they have a chapter they call the province of Khorasan, which is, the old name of Afghanistan, and it includes part of Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Central Asia. And they have been very active, and they have deployed very deadly attack on civilians in Afghanistan. And some of the videos that emerged, that it was worse than the things that they did in Syria and Iraq. But in terms of violence, and in terms of deploying a strategy of fear and atrocities, Taliban and ISIS would not be differentiated very much. Taliban did the same thing that ISIS is now doing in Afghanistan, in Iraq and Syria. They killed a lot of people. They were very discriminatory against women, against ethnic groups, minorities. They destroyed a lot of historical sites and relics and things like that, like Buddha statues in Afghanistan. And ISIS is doing the same thing. ISIS is actually a more advanced version of Taliban in terms of capacity to use the internet, YouTube and other means of propagation and propaganda. And Taliban is also using the same. But during the Taliban, they were hanging on the electricity tower, all TVs they could confiscate. They said it's not allowed, pictures were not allowed. And now suddenly, they are using, images and YouTubes and other issues in Afghanistan there. then there is one factor also there, that ISIS is trying to recruit from all over ethnic groups in Afghanistan. So, and that might be at the end a danger. And they are eyeing to go to Central Asia very much, because they are also recruiting from Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Kazakhstan, because they are looking more globally. And Taliban is, providing with continued war against the government of Afghanistan, providing the ground. And most of the ISIS members are defected Taliban members now joined ISIS in Afghanistan.
Very good. I think we're going to stop here for tonight. Of course, we can continue the discussion with some refreshments. I'd like to thank our guest again. Thank you so much.